Hi, welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're letting folks in and we'll get started in just 1 minute. Thank you, everyone. Welcome again, everyone. And welcome to today's webinar, which is our fourth in our housing series on creating housing opportunities for people with behavioral health needs in the justice system. Today, we're talking about the housing needs of, or talking about the business case in really making the case for investing in housing pathways that we've been talking about throughout the series. First things first, some housekeeping. Please ask any questions in our Q&A box. We'll also be providing some resources via chat. And you'll receive both slides and today's recording in our follow-up units, as you probably have been receiving the past few months. So we are the CSD Justice Center, a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization serving all three branches of state governments to increase public safety and strengthen communities, including through connecting folks to housing. And on the next slide, we're brought here today by the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance. And BJA works with communities, governments, and nonprofit organizations to reduce crime, recidivism, and unnecessary confinement. And on the next slide. And today we're very specifically brought here. We're brought here together by the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program. And sorry, my daughter is here with me today. So I know. Right. So on our next slide, we're partnering in this webinar series with the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And you'll get to hear from both Kim Keaton and Katie Badamaso today. Very lucky to have them here. And on the next slide, we're also partnering with Luken Solutions, and you'll hear from Sally Luken. We've worked with for a long time on making the business case and on housing. And on the next slide, our agenda today, we'll talk about why to make a business case. You'll hear about experiences with Denver's Social Impact Fund, and we'll get an overview on making the business case and the stories that are involved in making that case. And if everyone in chat could introduce themselves, as well as share something that's been really compelling for you when either hearing about or talking about the need for housing. Now that what we hear and what resonates with us, sometimes it's just something really great that we can focus on, but also sometimes we need to broaden our scopes of what may work or not. Oh, I see that chat is disabled. All right. Well, in that case, let's see. Well, we'll see if we can get a solution for that shortly, but would love to hear, but we'll see. Now, one thing for myself that's always been compelling has been that when we're making the case for housing, that can really open up resources for other things. And on the next. And on this is our fourth webinar, and yeah, we'll be very glad. Oh, good. Looks like chat has opened up. And we'll be very glad to have you back for our fifth session in in September. And on the next slide, our office hours session that we recently had a great discussion, got into funding, development teams, and the recording is now up. And we're looking forward to having you at our next office hours on Thursday, September 1st. And on this slide, we are really focusing this series. Great to see everyone here today. And we're focusing this series on the pathways, and we've gotten into prioritization and housing development our past two webinars. And the next webinar will focus on community-wide governance structures. And today's webinar focuses on making the business case again, but really making the case to invest in each and every one of these pathways. So I hope that you will enjoy today's webinar, and I think you'll find it all very useful. And with that, I will turn it over to Kim. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So happy to be here today to talk about making a business case for supportive housing. And I want to be clear, there's a lot of folks on this webinar, and I know this has been a series. I don't know if everyone has been following along with the series, but when we say housing, we're mostly usually talking about supportive housing for people at the intersection of justice, the justice system, and homelessness who have multiple or co-occurring behavioral health issues. And so with that, let's launch into my section. I will not speak for very long before we get to hear from Katie and Sally with some more on the ground examples. So when we say making a business case, usually that brings up to mind costs and money. It can feel somewhat icky to think of actual human people in financial terms as costing a lot. But in this instance, it's actually the humane intervention of supportive housing that is more cost effective than the status quo. The status quo is more expensive. What is the status quo? It really consists of the compounding costs of homelessness, which is inclusive of everything from outreach shelter and outreach services to the harder to capture costs associated with the community impact of street homelessness, and also includes policing costs, the cost to incarcerate folks, and the involvement with the court systems and probation. In addition to crisis healthcare utilization across the healthcare system, emergency transport, emergency rooms, inpatients at hospitals. This status quo is uncoordinated and does not produce positive outcomes for the people trapped in this cycle, nor for any of the systems that they touch. It's extremely uncoordinated. Housing, especially supportive housing, offers an opportunity to craft an intervention that at a minimum will shift costs from crisis care to preventative community-based care, and may actually be less costly in the long run. And plus, it's probably the right thing to do for the folks that we're talking about here. Next slide. So the previous session in this series, which I think was in mid to late July, covered the basics of supportive housing development. This slide is the basics of the basics of the basics of supportive housing development. But just as sort of a recap, when we talk about supportive housing, there are three main cost components that go into it: the capital, operating costs, and services. When we talk about making a business case for supportive housing, on the investment side of the equation, we have the three primary costs. Capital means the costs associated with building the housing. If necessary, rental units can also be used instead, although we do know that there's a severe lack of rental units in many places in the country. And so building housing is still necessary, even if you are able to use some rental units for housing and services. Then operating costs, which is the rent associated with keeping people in housing. This is usually coming from a voucher, but it could, like from a housing authority, for example, but it definitely could come from other sources. And then the services required to keep folks stably in housing and accessing the community-based services that they need to remain stable. These services are critical for people who are at the intersection of homelessness and justice involvement, and who have high rates. This particular intersection of folks has high rates of mental and behavioral health occurrence. And investments in these components of supportive housing offers an opportunity to break that cycle of crisis service use. Next slide. So again, in the language of investing and in the language of the private sector, usually we talk about a return on investment. And so what can we expect? What is usually found when folks are put into supportive housing who have this crisis system use in their pre-housing life? Supportive housing interventions have really been widely evaluated. This intervention and model has been developing and has been perfected over the last 30 years or more. And over time, studies have begun to produce similar results for how providing stable housing and services changes system use for people trapped in the jail, homelessness, crisis, healthcare cycle. Yes, www.csh.org/data. You don't have to read all these studies, which you don't want to. CSH has produced pretty handy research summaries that tell, sort of a little bit about the study and what the main outcomes were, which will include the types of outcomes I'm talking about here. So if you want to take a peek at those, if you go to that website and scroll all the way down to the bottom, I think you'll find those. So what are the types of outcomes and results that we can typically expect with a supportive housing intervention focused on people at this with this cyclical use? So first of all, we see reduce arrests and jail time. And so reduce number of times arrested on average, and reduce number of days in jail on average. We see the end, almost the total end of the use of shelters. I sort of call this the "if you build it, they will come" part of the research. It turns out that providing subsidized housing with services is a very sticky intervention in terms of keeping people out of the shelter system. You see shifts in healthcare utilization. You see particularly reductions in emergency room usage, ambulance usage, and inpatient hospitalization. But you do see rising costs in outpatient care, access money spent on medications, et cetera. The overall, on balance, this cost of outpatient care and additional use of medications to keep people's health conditions managed, typically is a little bit less than the emergency crisis care. But of course, that depends on the actual, how sick a person is, patient needs. And then you finally, repeatedly in the literature, we find that there are significant reductions in psychiatric inpatient hospitalization, which is a very expensive type of hospitalization. Next slide. So with all that, then, what do we mean by saying what is a business case for supportive housing? So really, it would estimate what the overall savings or crisis care cost offsets, which are costs associated with reductions in jail, reductions in shelter use, reductions or shifts in hospital healthcare use, would be after the intervention of supportive housing is paid for. So, for example, if a study on a similar population or a similar local program in your county, or at least in your state or a nearby or a similar state, saw, for example, 40% reduced jail days in jail, you know that your local jail costs $150 per person per night to house people in that jail. You can see how with some relatively easy math, you can arrive at an expected cost reduction after you account for how much you're paying for housing and services on average per person or across a whole program. The idea of a business case is not to really exactly get all the details perfect right, but it's to get stakeholders around the table and to make the case that supportive housing is the right intervention for your community for a specific population. One thing that people ask is, how do we know who the population is? How do we know who is exactly the right folks to target for the resources that we have for an intervention like this? A lot of communities find that a data match is the great first step in understanding the size and cost and utilization patterns of the population cycling between homelessness, jails, and other crisis services. So, a data match might be between the local homeless management information system data to jail data and or behavioral health system data or hospital or healthcare data. So those are that's a great first step. I know I make it sound really easy. It's a lot more complicated than that, but just to keep it in mind. And like I said, again, the business case does not need to have all the details figured out, such as how everything exactly would be paid for, but rather is used to generate interest and to get stakeholders to the table who might be interested in working on how an intervention like this might be structured, potentially might want to invest some of their agency or systems dollars in the intervention to pay for one of those three main buckets, etc. So you are going to hear more about how this was actually done in Denver and what the results were from Katie Bonamasso. And then after that, you'll learn some more nuanced information from Sally Luken about how to really attach a story to that business case and put a real personal face on it, which I think both of these things together can really help be a compelling story and make a compelling case in communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie.
Great. Thanks so much, Kim. Hi, everyone. My name's Katie Bonamasso. I'm with CSH, the Corporation for Supportive Housing. I'm on our Mountain West team based in Denver. And I think that the Denver SIB, or the Denver Social Impact Bond, we call it the SIB for short, is a great example of making the business case for supportive housing. It's a good example of how supportive housing can create positive outcomes for people and the broader community. So if you want to, next slide, please. So I think it's important. So the Denver SIB was funded using an innovative financing mechanism called Pay for Success. So we're going to start by talking about what Pay for Success is so that we have a little bit of a basis for our conversation today. So Pay for Success and social impact bonds, sometimes it's called social impact financing, are all the same things. It's not a bond in a conventional sense that we know in the United States that is issued from the federal government. It's really upfront working capital connected to performance-based contracts. And so the way this looked in Denver is that we recruited $8.6 million of upfront capital from private and philanthropic investors. There was actually 8 of them. And that money was connected to a performance-based contract that had 2 primary outcome measures connected to it. The first was housing stability. So our primary goal was to get people housed and keep them housed, and then reducing the number of days that people spent in jail. And if the program was successful in achieving the outcomes set forth in the contract, the city of Denver would actually pay our investors back. Spoiler alert, this program has ended. Investors have been fully repaid and the program is really successful. You could go to the next slide. So why would you consider pay for success? This is a great way to expand and improve outcomes for vulnerable populations. So like Kim said, we know in communities across the country, people are cycling in and out of costly emergency services and really aren't getting what they need from conventional services in the community. And so bringing in outside capital to a community can allow you to expand your supportive housing programs. And this can really help us shift the government's focus from measuring for paying to measuring and paying for outcomes, not just activities. So I think, you know, we all have had those like old contracts with folks where they ask you how many, you know, services you delivered or how much money you spent. And this is different than that. Payment is made if outcomes in the program are achieved. And so it kind of really shifts government to thinking about social programs in a new way. It's a great way to leverage new financial resources to directly fund an evidence-based intervention. So in Colorado, we've done a great job of putting packages of housing together for people experiencing homelessness. Now, this is not me saying that there's enough housing throughout Colorado or in Denver to serve folks, but we really have aligned resources to come together to develop as much supportive housing as we can. But the community really struggled to bring in resources to pay for the services needed to serve a highly vulnerable population. And so this $8.6 million that was brought into Denver was the largest amount of service funding we've seen connected to housing. And it was really exciting for everyone involved. And then finally, Pay for Success can provide the opportunity to bring diverse stakeholders together. Like focusing on the needs of one particular vulnerable population. And so you'll hear from me as we go through what the SIB looked like. We had involvement from the justice system, from the health system, from the homeless system, from our philanthropic community. And it was really the first time in Denver we all came together to talk about a common population with the goal of putting them in housing. Next slide. So how it all began in Denver. This is a picture of Reggie Herder. She's the former executive director of Denver's Crime Prevention Control Commission and Office of Behavioral Health Strategies. And she really, in her work, started noticing that there was tons of people in Denver that were really interacting with the criminal justice system and also a bunch of different organizations. So they were showing up at the hospital, in our detox facilities. They were showing up in jail. They were showing up in homeless shelters. And what Reggie realized is that there was no coordinated effort to serve this group of people that was showing up in multiple systems. And so she did the initial data match that showed where people showed up in these crisis services. Next slide. So we did this data match, like Kim said, this is oftentimes the first place that communities start. So we looked at data from HMIS, the Homeless Management Information System, the health system, emergency department data. So how many times are people showing up in the ER, detox facilities, and then city and county jail records. And what we found was for 250 people experiencing chronic homelessness in Denver, they had 14,000 days in jail, 2,200 visits to detox, 1,500 arrests, and 500 emergency room visits. So this just really proved the point that Reggie noticed, that these folks are showing up in all of our crisis care systems at great cost to our community and the taxpayers. So we estimate that, you know, before the program, all of these interactions with crisis care were costing the city about $29,000 per person per year, or on average $7 million in services in one year. And so we knew that we could do something better. Next slide. So here's some basic information of the project. The project launched in 2016. This was, I like to say that Pay for Success initiatives are labors of love. They take a long time to put together. So many of the partners in the community worked together for the few years before the program launched to really define the outcomes, to select the target population, to bring on the service providers. So really we started working on the initiative in 2014. It had a 5-year program operations that ended in December of 2020, and we released our final results last summer in July of 21. So the target population we decided on was 250 people experiencing homelessness in Denver who frequently used emergency services, jail, detox, and emergency rooms. I'll talk about this in more detail later, but we specifically selected a group who had 8 or more arrests in the 3 years prior to the program and who had a transiency indicator on their arrest record. This is the way the city of Denver marks people as homeless in their system. And so we didn't actually have a chronic indicator on our target population, but in the end, we ended up serving 98% of folks who had reached chronic homeless status, which says a lot for a group of people who spends a lot of time incarcerated. So our primary goal here was to address the underlying cause of homelessness, including mental health and substance use challenges, while also reducing costs in the criminal justice and emergency health system by providing supportive housing to folks in this group. Like I said earlier, the $8.6 million from 8 different investors was used to fund services. We did have a small pot of money that came from that $8.6 million to use as bridge housing as we were transitioning folks into their permanent placement. The project used a randomized control trial study that was led by the Urban Institute. So this is one of the most robust evaluations that has ever occurred on supportive housing. We're really excited to partner with Urban Institute, and we're going to share some of the outcomes that they published shortly. Next slide. So the service model we used in the SIB was what we called Modified Assertive Community Treatment, or ACT. With 2 provider agencies, the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless and WellPower, who is formerly called the Mental Health Center of Denver. ACT is a behavioral health model, an evidence-based behavioral health model that's used in the behavioral health world oftentimes. The reason we call it modified is that we applied this intervention to everyone in the program, regardless of their diagnosis. So in the conventional behavioral health world, you have to reach a certain diagnosis in order to be eligible for ACT. We said we think this model works for this high needs group, and we're going to apply it across the board. What that looks like is that 75% of the services happen in the community from an interdisciplinary team. So we have peer mentors, case managers, clinical case managers, therapists, prescribers, nurses, psychiatric nurse practitioner, all people on a team that serve one group of clients at like a 10-to-1 client to staff ratio. Our goals here are to help folks live independently and to have, individualized custom treatment plans to, use harm reduction and trauma-informed approaches in our services and apply housing first principles. So we want to quickly move people off the streets into low barrier housing as fast as we can. The picture here is of one of the SIB ACT teams at Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. So you can see some of the people who worked on the project. Next slide. The housing model in the SIB was kind of twofold. So we had 2 single site locations, and then the balance of people were put in scattered site housing vouchers throughout the Denver metro community. So the first property on the top left here, it's Renaissance Downtown Lofts. This is a low-income housing tax credit development that's owned, operated, and developed by Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, one of our service providers. It's 100 units. It's right downtown. Some of these units have outstanding views. If you see the corner windows there on that main tan part of the building, you can see all of downtown. The second building is Sanderson Apartments. It's a 60-unit low-income housing tax credit development that's owned, operated, and developed by WellPower, the Mental Health Center of Denver. This is just west of the city and south of the city. Sanderson has gotten recognized for their use of trauma-informed building design. Some great things that you see in the building work really well for people with big histories of traumatic experiences. There's very wide hallways. Each floor is color coded. There's lots of engagement space. There's tons of extra light. So they kind of really went the extra mile and tried to incorporate trauma informed behavioral health approaches into the design of their building. And then, like I said, 90 folks were placed in scattered site housing vouchers. We partnered with the State Housing Authority, also some continuum of care resources. Next slide. So this is a quick overview of the structure of the project. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but the blue arrows in this graphic show the flow of funds. And then the gray dotted arrows show a flow of achieved outcomes and possible payments. So starting at the top of the graphic, we have our investors. They provided $8.6 million to an intermediary entity, which was co-owned by CSH and Enterprise Community Partners. And the intermediary's role is just to really oversee the flow of funds in the transaction and to provide project management and provider support. So the intermediary got the money, contracted with the service providers to deliver the services to 250 people. The service providers provided their outcome data to the evaluator, which is down at the bottom of the graphic. And then the evaluator let the city of Denver know if outcomes were achieved. If they were, the city of Denver paid the money to the intermediary, who then paid the money back to investors. So that's kind of a quick overview of the way the structure looked. Next slide. So we had some great lessons learned in this initiative. So the first thing that we learned, and I thought would be important for this group today to talk about, is coordination with the justice system really helped us to achieve better outcomes for individuals in the program. So we did tons of outreach to judges, the court system, the district attorney's office, the public defender's office, just to explain the program and what we were trying to do, and explain, we're trying really to help people stay out of jail. And as we did, we really saw people, help us serve people in the programs better. So as an example, when we first started the initiative, case managers would show up at court with folks, and they'd have to wait a long period of time as they got through the docket. But we met one judge who said, if you're in court with staff, just tell the clerk and we'll see you first. And so it really helped us save time by talking with the judges and being seen on the docket first. Also, I think, because of their involvement in the program, access to housing and services, we saw people's sentences lessen as we showed up with them in places like court. And so that was really key to achieving great outcomes in the program. The second lesson learned is that this mix of housing models allowed us to find the best fit for most clients. Having scattered site vouchers and single site units, we were able to kind of flip-flop folks if one placement was not a great fit. It's not very common to have access to both types of housing, but we've really noticed that it helps folks to stabilize, and having that mix is really helpful. Coordination with the public housing authorities really paid off. So we had project-based Section 8 vouchers at the 2 single site locations from 2 different housing authorities, which meant 2 different policies, practices, procedures for folks applying for vouchers. And we were able to sit down with both housing authorities and say, hey, can you standardize your applications for these buildings? Can you use the same background check requirements that were stripped back from your typical policies? And that really helped us move people in quickly and apply our housing first approach. And then finally, this modified ACT model worked well for the population. I think as we do this work across the country, the closer providers get to the ACT model, the better outcomes we see in programs. And And so what we found is that this community-based interdisciplinary team model was really helpful to achieving great outcomes. Next slide. So now I'm going to walk us through some of the evaluation findings from the Urban Institute. So you can go to the next slide. So there was a number of reports that were released last summer. Once I'm done presenting here, I can pop all of these links into the chat so that you can access the reports if you want to take a peek yourself. But first, there was a final report that talked about the implementation, outcomes, and impacts of the program. The second report was the payment report, which really talked about that pay for success finance mechanism and what the investors earned back. There was an additional report on the health outcome measures in the project, and it showed the healthcare impact. And then there was a cost analysis report, which looked at all of the costs of the participant service utilization before and after the program. And then there's this virtual feature. If you're someone who kind of wants the highlights, this virtual feature is the best place to send yourself. It actually has outcomes from all of the final reports in the project, and you can click on things and it'll bring you back to the original report. So I'll make sure that you get that link. Next slide. So the evaluation of the Denver SIB. So like I said, it used a randomized control trial study that included 724 people, 363 in the treatment group, 361 in the control group. Next slide. We knew on average people in the program were 85% men, average age of 44. And like I said earlier, the target population was people who had 8 or more arrests in the 3 years prior to the program and who identified as transient at the time of arrest. So when we first looked at the data before we launched in 2012, 2014, we knew that 1,400 individuals met this criteria. And we were able to refresh our list with the Sheriff's Department every year. And as we did, that pulled more and more people into the eligibility list. So by the time we ended, there was 3,900 people in Denver who met this criteria. And, you know, I think a lot of times people ask, how do you pick the threshold for the justice utilization? And what we knew was 8 or more arrests when we looked at the data was kind of that sweet spot where the group was big enough that it would send us enough people for the program and for the treatment and control group, but also we were looking at health data in the background, and we knew that this group of people who had 8 or more arrests also had high numbers of interactions with the health system. At the time we struggled, we really wanted to make a health outcome measure part of the program, but at the time data sharing was too difficult. And so what we did was kind of do the health matching in the background and then selected 8 or more arrests as the primary criteria. Next slide. So this is what we called the engagement analysis. So this kind of shows how long it takes people to go from homelessness to housed. And we were excited to add this as part of our evaluation because sometimes this is not something that's included. And when you're putting together a pay for success framework where you have goals about, you know, how long it takes to get people in housing and the number of months they're there, it's really important information to know. So this is something other communities could use to approximate how long you can expect to move people from homelessness into housing. So what we learned was in the treatment group, 79% or 285 people were ultimately located, engaged, and housed. And then you can look on the right here, this table kind of shows how long each step took. So of the people in treatment, you know, who were located, engaged, applications approved, and ultimately leased up. So we were dealing with a group of people that providers had never met before. All they got was their name, first name, last name, and the last known address of the last time they were arrested. And so we think it's really great that providers could find people in 4 months and ultimately get them through the whole housing process, connected to vital documents, and ultimately leased up. Next slide. Here's another statistic we're really excited to share. So what we learned was when people experiencing homelessness were offered housing, most took it and stayed for the long term. And 77% of participants remained in stable housing after 3 years. So oftentimes when you look at supportive housing studies, they're only looking at housing stability at 1 year, sometimes 2 year, but we were excited to add to the evidence base a 3-year housing stability outcome. You know, I think this also like flips something that we hear on its head. You know, people say that people experiencing homelessness are not interested in housing. Of the 385 people that we talked to, only 1 refused the program. And so what we know is people who are experiencing homelessness take it and stay a long time. Next slide, please. The next thing we learned was that people in supportive housing received more housing assistance and spent fewer days in shelters on average than people receiving usual services in the community. So you can see there a 594% increase in housing assistance and a reduction of 35% of shelter days. Some people ask why people in the program might have shelter days after they move into housing. And we kind of see that as a trauma response, people going back to places they know to see their friends and family, and then they come back to housing. And over time, it kind of, you know, you see that trajectory go down. Next slide. The next thing we learned was people in supportive housing had fewer interactions with the criminal justice system on average than people receiving usual services in the community. So this equated to a 34% reduction in police contacts, a 40% reduction in arrests, and a 27% reduction in jail days. These were really significant results that we were excited to see. Next slide. People in supportive housing used less emergency health care and received more office-based care on average than people receiving usual care. So a 40% reduction in emergency department visits, 155% increase in office-based care for folks with psychiatric diagnosis. So what that meant was people were seeing psychiatrists, therapists, being connected to medications. And in fact, we saw people being connected to 8 unique medications once they were in the program. So that means that people were taking care of chronic health conditions that may not have been addressed when they were on the street. Next slide. And then people who were referred to supportive housing had 4 fewer visits to detox than those who received services as usual in the community. So we know people were spending less time outside, and specifically it was a 65% reduction in detox visits. And then there was a decrease in EMS responses, but it wasn't significant, although we included it here as well. Next slide. So in total, what we learned was approximately half of the total cost per person in the Denver SIB was offset by avoided costs for other emergency public services. So you can kind of see each system here on the right: public safety, prison, emergency shelter, police, courts, with the biggest savings in days in jail, saving on average $2,386 per person per year. For a total savings or cost offset of $6,875 per person per year. Next slide. We did look at race data in the SIB, and to try to see if there was an impact of supportive housing by race and ethnicity, and we didn't find any significant variation in the impact of services. What I can say is that in the population that was pulled into the program, we had a high population of people who were BIPOC, which kind of mirrors what you see in the justice system, kind of that systemic racism flowing through. If that's the criteria we used for the program, we had a higher percentage of people that were Black, Native American, Asian American, pulled into the program compared to the general population in Denver. And we're hoping to add more questions to future studies about what the experiences of BIPOC participants in our next program will be. Next slide. So finally, just to share a little bit about where Denver's going. So there a couple of cool things happened while we were implementing the program. The first was midway through the project, the city of Denver added an additional 75 slots. They hadn't even seen the formal outcomes reports yet, but they could see the difference we were making in people's lives, and they said they wanted to do more. They kind of stripped out the complicated pay for success structure and entered into a direct performance-based contract with the providers, which for us, that was really exciting because it meant that that shift to looking at outcomes kind of transferred to the way the city of Denver did business. Additionally, after the program ended, the city of Denver agreed to fund all 325 participant slots on an ongoing basis through the same type of performance-based contract. So they worked with the providers to kind of understand what revenue they received from Medicaid, and they agreed to fill in the gap so that they could keep those folks in housing and keep the program going. Additionally, the city of Denver was awarded a grant through CIPRA, the Social Impact Partnership to Pay for Results Act, which launched in July of 2022. So we just celebrated the launch of a new initiative that really uses the basis of the SIB, but adds a health outcome metric. So when we look back at the data for the SIB, we could tell that we saved $5,800 per year per person in Medicaid costs. And so we use that data for our application to CIPRA. And so the way it will work is that the housing stability and reduction in jail day outcomes will be paid by the city of Denver. And then any savings we see in the net reductions in federal expenditures will be paid by the Department of Treasury through the CIPRA award, which is $5.5 million. We're also working in Colorado to explore the use of ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act funds, to kind of pair emergency housing vouchers with service funding at our state Medicaid office, Healthcare Policy and Finance, HCPF we call them. And so we're in the process of launching a new initiative that will scale this type of intervention to communities kind of across the state of Colorado. So thanks so much for listening to the story of the SIB and about Denver. And I'm going to turn it over to Thomas, who will introduce Sally.
Thanks,
Okay,
Katie.
are we going to answer? There's a few live questions, and I was wondering if we should deal with those questions before we move to Sally, or wait till the end.
Yeah, I was thinking that we'll hold questions till the end at this point, and we'll get to which questions we can today, and those that we can't get to, we'll incorporate into our office hours in 2 weeks from today. And thank you, Kim and Katie. It's such important work that's happened in Denver, and some that clearly can see that folks want to replicate elsewhere in the country already. And now, with that, I'll turn it over to Sally Luken for a presentation. Sally.
Thanks, Thomas, and really fantastic outcomes in Denver. And what I'm going to share is a little different, and it probably comes from the fact that I have been a part of some of these same kinds of activities, not necessarily the SIBs, but where larger cities were able to pull resources together and make some things happen. And the work that I'm going to share with you came about because my experience is people are really parochial. What worked in Chicago or LA, they don't always feel like can work for their local rural community or suburban community. So I want to talk a little bit about how we use making the business case along with telling the story to get people to take action. Next slide. So from our perspective, why it is important to make the business case is some of us, me included, are visual learners, and research bears that out, that if you can visually represent the costs of someone that's frequently flying or is a frequent face, it can get people's attention. And a number of elected officials that I've worked with, they are much more moved to action when they're confronted with the public costs that keep getting spent on someone who's not getting any better. And it can also help bring people to the table that maybe didn't see they had skin in the game before seeing what systems were involved in someone's lives and what it was costing. And then the big one is it just really does demonstrate again visually what happens if you don't do anything. Next slide. And then in terms of telling the human story, which is, as Kim had mentioned early on, is important. You know, in our society, we still expect people to pull themselves up from their bootstraps. You know, there's been some tempering of that given all of the challenges during COVID with people's behavioral health issues and the skyrocketing use of opiates and suicides. But I still find that folks really have somewhat a lack of understanding that this is what we're talking about are some health issues. They're not that people don't care, that's not that they can't try. And if you don't know about things like ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, I encourage you to ask your behavioral health partners and friends, what does that mean? Because those things are real about what happens to folks as they age with those adverse childhood experiences. And then the whole thing about the fact that folks should just stop using, get it together. There's also a theory about the stages of change. And again, if you're not familiar with that, I encourage folks to talk to your behavioral health folks about those stages. They apply to all of us when we want to try to make a difference or do something different. I am guilty of it, just like keeping up with some physical activity and working out. I often go through the stages of change myself in terms of getting myself motivated to get back into the shame of things. And I really think telling the person's story can demonstrate, again, we're really talking about a healthcare issue and that people do recover. Next slide. So in my opinion, and in what we've experienced in the communities I've worked with, you really have to do both. You have to make that business case about an individual as well as telling their story to move people to action. Next slide. So in Ohio, our state supports what are called Coordinating Centers of Excellence, or CCOEs. They are based in our universities, and this particular one works on evidence-based practices around the intersection of criminal justice and mental health. And this CCOE does what are called sequential intercept mapping, or SIMS, work with local counties that want to look at that intersection and that population. What do they need to do differently? and summarizing the SIM's priorities of a number of counties in our state of Ohio, what we found was that housing was among the top 3 priorities that counties felt like they needed to address to actually stop the cycling of folks with behavioral health issues. And so the Stepping Up Ohio project hired me, along with support from PEGS Foundation, which is a family foundation based in Northeastern Ohio that invests in any ways to improve mental health services, to figure out ways to help our counties develop housing to get at this population. But before I share what we've done, I want to explain some things about the methodology. Next slide. So what I ended up creating was a tool that I've used with several counties, and the tool estimates costs, but I want you to know that these are really just estimates. It's not nearly as robust and as impressive as the Denver SIB. We didn't have the money to hire researchers to double check all of these things. And what we've also found is that if someone allows us to use their data and to dig some into different systems or not, can also make a difference in terms of the estimates. The monetary values that are used in the tool I created are based on Ohio averages. And unless a local community gave me their costs, they know how much a jail day costs, we used the defaults that were in the tool I created. Next slide. So this is the first one that we worked on. This is the business case of a gentleman. And as you can see, over the course of 8 years, he just cycled in and out of multiple systems. And every time he was released from jail, those first 3 years, he actually didn't become homeless. He went back to mom's house. And quite actually, that was not a good place for him to be. There was a lot of dysfunction in that house. And his mom and stepfather were really ill prepared to deal with his behavioral health issues. He did a stint in state prison, as you can see, because one of the times he was at mom's house, he set fire to the neighbor's front porch because the demons were after him. And then he also assaulted a deputy when he was in jail. He was pink slipped out of state prison to a state psychiatric hospital in Ohio. But if it's anything like any of your experiences, the average length of stays in a state psychiatric hospital for our state anyway are very short, 5 to 7 days at most. If you go into a private psychiatric hospital here, it's even less. It's only 3 days. So he was pink slipped out to a state hospital, but then over the next 2 years, he cycled in and out of hospitals, both state and the private hospital in his local county. Next slide. And actually, there were 7 different systems that this gentleman interacted with over those 8 years, not the 3 that I just mentioned. So we're not just talking about the county jail, state prison, and healthcare, but law enforcement ended up being a chunk of money because they were picking him up every time, of course, when he was in and out of jail. But he also ended up being taken to the emergency room by law enforcement. And we also calculate with this tool, are they before a judge? What are the court costs involved in having somebody be there? And transportation was a cost too. He did end up being on Medicaid, and Medicaid in some cases transported him to some of those hospitals. And then before the 8-year odyssey was completely over, the local reentry team, we have a number of those in Ohio, they saw that they needed to do something different, and they started working with him before the 8 years was up. Next slide. So using the tool that I created and the Stepping Up team in Delaware County, Ohio, we actually calculated his costs. And as you can see, over those 8 years, the public spent over $644,000 on this gentleman. And if they had put him into the type of housing he eventually got into with the services that he got, it would have cost the public less than $200,000. And quite honestly, he would have gotten better sooner, faster if he had the appropriate housing with the services he needed. Next slide. So what's his human story? So this is Brent. He has given us lots of permission to use his story. It's been public, but I think all you have to do is just look at his mugshot. You know, during his cycling, he was psychotic. He was terribly afraid, and he really physically, he wasn't healthy. Next slide. But this is Brent now. He has been appropriately housed with services for over 6 years. He's never set another fire. He doesn't do alcohol or drugs. He even has a little job. And I want you to know his team initially was 20 people, and it included Delaware County, Ohio's fire chief. Now, the fire chief only sat on the team's meetings for about the first 3 months, but that just shows you the commitment that this county made to making sure Brent got better. Now his team is much smaller. It's about 3 folks. And I want you to know that those calculations that we made, where it showed that really over the 8 years, the public would have spent less than $200,000, we took into account that larger team. So in a way, it was kind of like the modified ACT team that Katie talked about in the Denver SID. We have ACT teams here. We also have FACT teams, forensic, assertive community treatment teams. And so we took that into account in his calculation. Next slide. So case number 2 I want to share with you is a little different. And I say that it's one gentleman touching 3 rural counties. And the rural county that he's originally from is in what we consider Appalachia, Ohio, but he moved around a lot. And as you can see, in terms of the systems that kind of covered his costs for those 3 years, a big chunk of it was hospitalizations in ER and law enforcement runs, because often, again, they were picking him up. And those law enforcement runs weren't only city police, but county sheriffs, because in his home county, there is a city, Chillicothe, but there's also the county. And they often were the ones that were actually not just taking him to jail when he got picked up, but also taking him to the ER. And you'll notice down at the bottom, it says homeless shelters, 0%. And it's not that he never used them, but what he would not agree to was signing a release of information for us to be able to look at all the public systems he may have touched. So I want to just talk a little bit about these triangles here in this pie. So we use just publicly available data, since he wouldn't sign a release of information. His name is often in the paper, going before the judge, and the police and sheriff runs we were able to get because of its public information. And from those, we could also determine that he ended up going to the ER. So we could make some assumptions then about his hospitalization in ERs. We used some national research on those assumptions, and it's from CSH. They did some groundbreaking work in California, God, probably 20, 25 years ago, but it's still really good data and information. So we used that to make some assumptions about his likely days or hours in the ER and in a behavioral health bed in the local hospital. Now, I don't know if you know this, but under Obamacare, hospitals have to publish their transaction costs for anything. that their hospital may provide. And so we did an initial summation of his costs using those publicly available amounts. But Ohio has Medicaid expansion. This particular county has a VA hospital, and folks felt we really needed to check what those costs were as opposed to using the published costs, because more than likely the public paid for those hospital runs. So we actually asked the hospital to check the rates that we had originally calculated and then tell us whether or not the cost was more likely either Medicaid or VA. And so they gave us their Medicaid billable rates, and that's what we used in this calculation. Next slide. So as I mentioned, he wouldn't sign a release, and still for the 7 years that we knew he cycled in and out of jail and used police runs and the court system, his costs were nearly $144,000 to the public, would have cost less than $100,000 if he had been in the appropriate housing with some pretty robust services. And unfortunately, John Doe is still cycling. He's still not doing well. So in this tool I created, we are able to calculate the potential cost over somebody's lifetime if an intervention isn't done. And we thought it was important for this county to see that if they don't do something for John, then they are likely going to spend over $1 million on this guy if he even lives. As you probably know, folks with behavioral health issues don't live very long. And so we have in the tool, I think it's like 62, we would assume somebody may live till, and still John could cost over $1 million. Next slide. So as I mentioned, unfortunately, John still isn't doing well. And we do know that he was arrested earlier this year. He could be any one of these folks. It's kind of complicated why he's still not engaged. I mean, he's sort of engaged, but why he can't seem to stay stable. He does get picked up basically for quality of life crimes. So public intoxication, violating probation. He has had a parole officer a number of times, some disruptive behavior. And I noticed that I think even the question was asked of the Denver SIB, how come people are still using services? Well, you know, this is an example, I think, of how long it takes folks to get recovery and stay in recovery. John Doe is a good example of that. He gets engaged, but it's been very, very difficult for him to stay clean and sober and stay engaged. Next slide. So since housing for frequent faces in our stepping up communities is high, I always share these two frameworks for communities to think about how to go about solving this issue. The one on the left, the 6 components for systems change, I'm going to talk a little bit about those in a minute. These 3 steps to solving the housing need, I just want to say, you know, going the way that Denver did, or the New York studies have done in New York City, or even what's been done in Ohio around folks coming out of prison that need permanent supportive housing. Those are all fantastic research-based projects that can drive decision-making and keep resources flowing. But I've just found in an awful lot of counties, they can't afford to do that. So I just keep emphasizing it doesn't take rocket science to actually solve a housing need. And the first one is just figuring out how many people we're talking about. Is it 5, 50, 500, or the 4,000 that it looks like it is in Denver? And most communities I work with do not have the capabilities of doing electronic data matching. We're lucky if every day the local jail is sending their booking data over to the Behavioral Health Authority to do a manual match. But a manual match, especially in a smaller community or in a rural county, can actually be very effective. And I've worked with communities to set up just short-term data discovery work groups to do just that. So once you figure out how many people we're talking about, 550, 500, then there really is some kind of easy ways to do a back of the envelope calculation on the types of housing that you need and the units that you need. To some degree, you got to know what your inventory is to begin with, because you do actually use your current inventory and what's called turnover to help take care of the folks that need it most. And then the third step is always finding the money, and people feel like that's the toughest thing to happen. CSH is really good at figuring this out. There's lots of consultants that can help figure this out. I think making the business case can help bring local resources to the table and get people to talk to each other. In Ohio, we set up a landlord risk mitigation fund for this particular population. And then I know several of you have talked about ARPA. That new money is good juicing the wheels. So let's talk about that first framework, because I have found actually it's kind of a challenging thing that I find in a lot of communities. Next slide. But I want to give credit where credit's due. This is a CSH publication. It's old, but it's been my Bible for probably the last 25 years in all the work that I've done around housing, affordable housing, permanent supportive housing, adult care facilities. And it's based on a look at multiple communities across the country and what made things work for them in terms of creating housing and sustaining it for folks that need it. Next slide. So these are the 6. So leadership, you got to have somebody that's committed, that's considered respected, and that can keep kind of people's feet to the fire and help keep them accountable to getting things done. And that's probably the toughest one I've found in some communities, is to find the person who's willing and able to do that and stay in that role for multiple years. The second one is having a group of committed people that are really the decision makers. So not sending staff to meetings, but having the folks that can make decisions, make commitments, put in resources to be a part of that planning process. And then the third one, that financial leveraging, a lot of folks think you have to find new money, but honestly, it starts with just redirecting a little bit of old. And a good example of that is I know of at least 2 rural communities in our state that the local housing authority has unused housing vouchers, which to me is a gold mine. They have unused housing vouchers because people can't find rental units that will pass HQS. That's the old money that can help bring new money and flush out the finances that needed for this sort of work. And then the fourth one is building and sustaining capacity in providers. And that's on those 3 stools that a lot of folks talk about. Somebody that knows how to develop new units, somebody who knows how to do property management, which is the operations piece, and then the services piece. And I love that in Denver, they supported folks that know trauma-informed care and that understand what it means to do a team approach to supporting folks. And it's not just teaching and training the one time, but continuously doing that, because there's turnover in agencies. And again, CSH does a great job of that. If you know anything about their training academy, if you don't, Google it, or I'm sure Kim could tell you more. And then on the credible data, And when I say credible data, when they talk about credible data, it doesn't have to be clean, perfect stuff. So the one community that I helped them create a data work group, they had to do some manual matching. And when they came up with a number, what we did is we just gave the assumptions behind the number of people, what information was used to figure it out, and with a promise that over time, they as a community would work to make their data better, but at least it gave them a starting point on a number. And then the networks of allies is really beyond the normal suspects, I guess you would say, in the disciplines that would be involved in this. And I just love it that if the criminal justice folks that have come to the table and been a part of this because of the Council of State Governments work, because of the Stepping Up initiative, because of CSH's work, and lots of other people, you know, judges have been fantastic for us in Ohio. Probation officers, public defenders, those folks can help make things happen and really get behind this sort of work. Next slide. But I want to talk about one of these components, because to me, as I mentioned before, this has really been some of the most challenging things that I've come across in the communities I've worked with, not just in Ohio, but across the country. I used to be a HUD TA provider. And that is how important it is to have your champion identified, but then supported and maintained throughout the time that it's going to take to pull some of this stuff off. And I want to give you the example of a major one we have in Ohio. Some of you may recognize her name, Evelyn Lundberg Stratton. She was formerly on our Ohio Supreme Court. Prior to that, she was a local judge in our capital city and county. And she found all these folks with behavioral health issues, especially mental illness, that kept cycling through her local court. But then she saw even some of the implications of it when she was at the Supreme Court. And she, first of all, she's a Republican, and she had a reputation on court as the Velvet Hammer. So she didn't mess around when it came to somebody violating the law, but she has this way about her that she smiles a lot. She's an attractive woman. She can kind of disarm people and soften the blow of like taking the law on them. And she became committed to this work and has used her reputation, her network, her knowledge of the criminal justice system, and her style to open doors that we did not have open before. And a good example of that is I took her with me to visit the Federal Home Loan Bank office that's here in Ohio that invests money in housing for folks with disabilities. And she was totally disarming to those guys. And ends up, she connected with one of them because the woman had a son who had mental health issues. And that relationship opened the door to have that Federal Home Loan Bank invest more in housing in Ohio than they had been doing before. So I really encourage you to focus on getting and keeping a champion. Next slide. So I just want to wrap up with saying, I just think it's really important to make an impact locally, even if you don't have tons of money for a researcher or your population is small, like some of the ones in Ohio. And I worked with a county with 300,000 population for the entire county, and in another one, 52,000. So to me, this can be done no matter what the size of your community is. But you have to make some sort of business case that's relevant, I think, to the local folks. And tell that human story that's associated with that person who may be costing your public systems a lot of money. And I really strongly believe in not only finding your champion, but then doing whatever you need to do to support that person and maintain them in that role. And with that, Thomas, back to you.
Thanks, Sally. And yeah, just a fantastic recap of all of that work and fantastic overview. And to echo Patricia's comments in chat, this both yours and the CSH's presentation is just so so energizing, and really appreciate all of this work. I think we have probably about 5 minutes for questions to both Katie and Kim and Sally, and then we can move on to our resources and next steps. Start with I see. Yeah, if anyone has any last questions, otherwise we will certainly be taking questions for our office hours session in 2 weeks. So I'll give a minute for questions before we move on. Well, if you have questions as we're going through, I'll happily pause so you can answer those. Yeah, so our next office hour is coming up on Thursday, September 1st at 2 p.m. And the link is below to register. Let me also put that into chat.
Thomas, it looks like Layla has her hand raised. I don't know if she can answer. Layla Powell.
Thank you, Brooke. Yep. I will. There we go. So you can, Layla, you can unmute and ask your question. Thank you.
So my question actually was answered. It was about whether there was on-site provision of services to facilitate office visits at the Denver complexes. But I did have another question, if I can sneak in there with one. Other than the social impact method, which is a fairly complicated financing structure, if the panelists could address how the fact that in many jurisdictions, the entity that would invest money to provide this solution is not the entity that is paying for the services where the savings are realized. Just the mismatch between what's required from a jurisdiction to create these kinds of supportive structures versus, if the county's saving money on their sheriffs, there may not be any incentive for them to make an upfront investment because they don't have that housing department under their control.
This sounds like the classic wrong pocket problem.
I just put that in the chat.
Yeah. But Kim, yeah, if you'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious if Katie and Sally have any other thoughts. That is certainly a reality. I can't say that there's necessarily an easy answer to it. There are some other sort of similar-ish large-scale initiatives that CSH has worked with in Los Angeles and Chicago that involves a different financing mechanism called a flexible housing pool. And in that case, it takes the savings concept is sort of taken out of it, and it's more just like a shared responsibility. So you have multiple systems putting money into a pool that is then flexibly deployed across rental support, sometimes even capital, and certainly services. And so, there are other types of financing models that aren't necessarily needing to have that solve for that wrong pocket problem, where different systems can put money into something and that can all solve the same problem. So
yeah, I would add or support what Kim just said by saying in Ohio, I think because we spent so many years preaching about this and showing the evidence that it's across systems, even though those systems don't all have the same source. I think it's finally sunk in to folks that they all have skin in this game, and that they may not feel directly, initially anyway, the savings. In the long run, public systems are going to save and people are going to get healthier. And so an example of that is our landlord risk mitigation fund. It took me 3 years of bringing a group of people together, cross systems at both the state, and we had some local criminal justice systems involved in talking about it, looking at samples of how it's worked in other places. And again, I have to just give credit with credit due. Justice Evelyn Lundberg Stratton, she would needle and push people too. You know, look what this work group's coming up with. Sally keeps preaching, we need a landlord risk mitigation fund. And we got 3 state agencies that put money together. And one of the state agencies was willing to be the administrator, and the other one was willing to be the fiscal agent. And they worked out how to make that happen. Because again, I think they all started to see the writing on the wall that they all were going to benefit. Our state was going to benefit if people are better, if people are healthier, and if we don't have them cycling. So keep at it.
Great, thank you, Sally and Kim. Let's see any other hands raised as of yet or questions. So we'll keep wrapping up. Please feel free to pause this or throw them in chat, and we will either answer them or we will again incorporate them into office hours in 2 weeks. On the next slide. So our next session will be September 22nd, and it will be on our 3rd pathway of community level steps for cross-system or cross-sector collaboration to increase housing opportunity. And again, that's available on our series page that I just posted in chat on the next slide. Among the resources we thought would be useful for today would include our Financing the Future's local initiatives, which includes some financial sustainability planning. So once you're into these making the business cases, helps for some planning with sustainability from that point, and seeing what would be needed to sustain your programs. I do see a question from Patricia on what are the three state agencies that came together. Apologies, was that to Patricia, was that to Sally or to Kim?
I think that one's to Sally, to the 3 state agencies in Ohio.
Oh, that did the landlord. So,
Yeah.
So the biggest one, because again, I just kept pushing. So don't give up pushing, is our Ohio Housing Finance Agency, you know, the state agency that distributes tax credits for low-income housing. And we also have a housing trust fund here, and they distribute some of those dollars. We have a state Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. So behavioral health is one state agency. They put money in. And then quite honestly, it was the staff at our Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services that went to our state Department of Rehab and Corrections. And I have to say that Ohio is one of only 2 states in the country that still has rehab in their title for the prison system. And so our Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services went to the staff at our Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation and asked them to also participate, because they got it that some of those folks going into jail could eventually commit a crime that would send them to state prison. And so they saw this as a investment in stopping it before it happens.
Sally. So on our next slide, also want to leave you some resources on working through estimates and costs on the criminal justice side. This includes our confined and costly report. And on the next slide, our related course corrections cost calculator that is just exceptionally helpful in pulling out some of these costs and estimates. And on the next slide, as well, CSH resources, as Sally mentioned, just so very many from CSH, from Kim and Katie and their colleagues. And on the next slide, again, want to lift up HUD's resources on this area as well, especially at this intersection. And on the next slide, that takes us to the end. So really appreciate all of your time today. And many thank yous to Kim and Katie and Sally for sharing all of their experiences and expertise today. And we will hope to see you both in 2 weeks on the 1st, as well as on the 22nd for our final webinar. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.